Sehr geehrte Gäste, dear guests, welcome to the cycle Donnerstagabends im Museum, Thursday evening at the museum. Today's lecture is about Michaelina Wautier. It's also connected to the special exhibition, possible to see at the galleries at the moment. And its title is Michaelina Wautier, Uncovering the Artist Through Technical Studies. My name is Odlozil. I'm a paintings restorer conservator at the museum. And I have the pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Kirsten Derks. I have a personal connection to Michaelina. I restored 2, maybe 3 paintings by her. One is in question. And because of Michaelina, I also met my partner in Antwerp. So I owe her a lot. Michaelina Wautier is one of the few female painters in Western art history. She was born 1604 in Mons in Belgium, and she died 1689 in Brussels. But unlike with her colleagues like Artemisia Gentileschi or Lavinia Fontana or Sofonisba and Guisola, her biography is covered in a lot more mystery. We don't even know anything about her education to become a painter. But today we will find out a lot more about her by examining her work and her technique, taking a closer look. Kirsten Derks finished her studies at the universities of Nijmegen and Amsterdam with a PhD at the University of Antwerp in 2023. Her dissertation was titled Scanning Michael Sweerts and Michaelina Wautier, Uncovering the Working Methods of 17th Century Brussels Artists by Means of MAXRF Scanning. And she's currently appointed a junior postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Antwerp, where she also conducts technical research on paintings by 17th century female artists, including our Michaelina Wautier, but also Judith Leister and Rachel Reusch. So no doubt we have the right person with us tonight. Welcome with me, Dr. Kirsten Derks.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And it's nice to hear this personal anecdote that Michaelina brought you the love of your life as well. That's amazing. First of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Kunsthistorisches Museum to invite me to talk about Michaelina Wautier. I've been doing research into Michaelina Wautier since 2019. The type of research that I do can be called technical art history. So that means that I use technical studies, scientific methods, and chemical methods to really learn about these paintings. And that tells us something about the artist as well. So today I will talk about my technical studies into paintings by Michaelina Wautier and what that has taught us about her as an artist. I will start with a brief introduction, and after which I will explain the methodologies that I use most often. That is, I must say, the boring part. After that, it will be very brief. After that, I will talk about a few case studies, and I think that's the most enlivening part of my presentation. So I don't know if any of you has already had the chance to see the exhibition. Michaelina Wautier is still a big mystery to us. We know that she existed, obviously, but we know very little about her. There's very few archival documents about her. There's very few evidence that tells us something about her as a person or as an artist. And most of the information that we do have, most archival sources are indirect. So that means that the information is not coming directly from her, but rather from her brother or other people in the vicinity of her. What we do have, however, are her paintings. There are about 35 to 40 paintings that we know now by her hand, and most of them are signed, which is good because then we know exactly that she made those paintings. And they form a secure set of paintings that we can use for comparison with paintings that are not signed by the artist. Moreover, Michaelina Wautier also painted 2 self-portraits. I'm showing you the one in the Triumph of Bacchus here. And these 2 self-portraits, they really give us a nice insight into the way that she wanted to present herself to the outside world. And I will show you the other self-portrait later, but this is already a nice sort of introduction into her as an artist. So the types of research methods that I use, I'm quickly going to go over this, but I think it's important for you to understand the type of research methods that I use to get a sense of the type of data that I'm working with and how I interpret this and how I come to my conclusions. I use a variety of research techniques, the most important ones being the imaging techniques, so those on the far left. And that is basically all types of photography. So we can use visible light photography, but we can also use photography using different types of light and different types of radiation to look underneath the surface of a painting and to get a sense of the material composition and the layer buildup. So for instance, we can use infrared radiation and X-rays. They pass through certain paint layers or through the entirety of an object, so we can really see what is underneath the surface. The other, one of the other important methods that I use is microscopy. And we can do that in several ways. First, we have non-invasive microscopy. So that is basically you take a microscope, take it to the painting, and look at the painting through the microscope. This is very useful because you get a sense of the type of paint mixtures you use. You can get a sense of the mixtures of pigments. For instance, flesh tone, it's usually a mixture of white, red, brown, yellow, blue, black. So there's a lot of different pigments involved in a painting. So you can get a sense of which pigments were used. You can also get a sense of the layer buildup, of what is original or what is maybe non-original paint. And you can get a sense of how the paint was applied. So how did the artist apply this paint? We also have an invasive way of microscopy. So that is basically when you take a tiny piece of the painting and embed it in resin and study that with a microscope. And I have an example here, if I can ask one of my dear colleagues to pass it around. So this is a little piece of resin with a paint sample in it. Just I'll pass it around so you can see how small this actually is. So basically, we take a tiny bit of the painting, we embed it in resin and polish it in such a way that we can get a clear view of the stratigraphy or the layer buildup of the painting. Here is an example of a photograph, of a microphotograph of such a paint sample, where you can see there's like a ground layer and then multiple paint layers on top. And again, we can study these samples with different lighting, so with visible light, but also with UV light. And we can also use scanning electron microscopes to even study them with an even higher magnification and do identification of specific pigment particles within that paint sample. Finally, I also use analytical techniques based on X-rays, most notably XRF. XRF stands for X-ray fluorescence, and this is a technique with which in which we basically shoot X-rays at a painting, and that creates a chemical, or not a chemical reaction. I'm sorry. When we shoot X-rays at a painting, the atoms in the the painting gets excited, as we call it. So the X-rays shoot an electron out of its orbit from the atom. This is what we call an excited state. It's not stable, and the atom wants to return to its stable state. And it does so by basically moving one of the electrons from the outer shell to the inner shell. And when it does that, the atom releases energy in the form of fluorescence, and that is also in the form of X-ray. So that's why we call it fluorescence, X-ray fluorescence. And for every chemical element in the world, that fluorescence has a specific energy, and we can measure that, and based on that, we can identify the chemical elements in a painting. So for instance, I hope this is a little bit visible. Iron, for instance, has a fluorescence of 6.5 and 7.5 keV. For arsenic, that fluorescence has an energy of 10.5 and 11.5 keV. So every chemical element has a different energy of fluorescence, so we can really identify what is in a painting. And these chemical elements we can associate with pigments and conservation materials. XRF, we can do it in two ways. We have PXRF, which stands for point XRF, so we can do just one spot analysis, and you use like a gun, it looks like a gun like that, where you can just point at the spot that you want to analyze and you get the result immediately. It's very easy and fast, and it's great. But if you want to do more spots in a painting, then it gets a little bit tedious. The data processing might take a while, and that's why researchers have developed macro XRF scanning, which basically works the same way, but we now mount the gun on a device that basically scans the entire painting, and we use software to turn the spectra into images. So after such a macro XRF scan, you get a series of black and white images, one for each chemical element detected in the painting. And we call these distribution maps because they show us where a specific chemical element is present and how that is distributed over the surface of the painting. This will become clearer when I start to talk about the case studies. And I talk about how I interpret this. So one of the case studies I wanted to talk about today is Wautier's flower garland with butterfly. Here we see the two flower garlands by Wautier that are now the only flower pieces by her hand that have come down to us. They are both signed and dated, so we are sure that she painted them, and they both form a pendant pair. These paintings somewhat come out of the blue because before we knew of these paintings, we thought that Michaelina Wautier was a portraitist or a history painter, but we didn't know that she painted flower pieces. So it's great that they were signed because otherwise no one would have associated these paintings with Michaelina Wautier. And that has to do with the fact that most female artists in the 17th century had a specialization, so they would only paint flower pieces or they would only paint genre paintings. And Michaelina Wautier was very exceptional in that she painted like the entire range of painting genres possible. But we only know of these two flower paintings by her hand, but they are still of exceptional quality. They are super well painted. They are like among some of the best flower paintings from the period. And I was wondering, where did she learn to paint flowers? We assume that Charles, her brother, taught her to paint portraits and history paintings, and that can make sense, but Charles never painted any flowers, not even included in his history scenes or in his portraits. He never painted a flower. And creating such complex and intricate composition, it really requires a different approach, and painting flower pieces also required a different painting technique. It's completely different to painting the portrait of a man or of a woman. So I was interested if we could learn more about how she did this and where she got her inspiration from. So flower garland with butterfly was studied in the context of my PhD dissertation. And I did a microscopic examination of this painting, macro XRF scanning, and also one paint sample was extracted from the area here, the blue area in the pink rose. And that paint sample was also studied with optical microscopy. Just to show you what our setup looks like when we do XRF scanning, this is the in-house built XRF scanner of the University of Antwerp. And the analysis took place in the offices of the Noord-Brabants Museum. That is not very usual. Normally we would do it in a conservation studio, but this is why it looks like an office setting. So we see the painting on the easel. We have an y-axis and an x-axis. And mounted on that we have, it's not visible here, but we have our X-ray source and our X-ray detectors, and this allows for like a complete scanning of the surface of the painting. Such a scan, even of, like, this is not a big painting, it's relatively small, but it takes about 24 hours to do the scanning, and then you have to process the data and do the interpretation of that data. But this is what the result looks like. So we have a series of black and white images, each representing an element that is detected in that painting. Full disclosure, I left a couple of images out. So what you see here are the the distribution maps of the chemical elements that can be associated with the original painting materials used by Wautier. Of course, we also detected materials that were that can be linked with conservation treatments or later overpainting, but I did not include that in this slide because I'm personally not interested in conservation history of this painting. I want to know what Michaelina did, so that's what I'm showing you here. So we see a series of black and white images. We have, for instance, lead, calcium, potassium, iron, manganese, copper, mercury, and arsenic. And all of these elements can be associated with pigments that Wautier used. I will just quickly go over a couple of them that are the least interesting. For instance, in the lead map here in the top middle, lead can be associated with the pigment lead white, which was the only white pigment available for 17th century artists for working in oil. So in every 17th century painting we encounter lead because lead white is present everywhere. So what we see here is basically where lead is present. Everywhere where this picture is white, the lead has been detected in a relatively high quantity, so there's a lot of lead white present in those areas. And where the image is black, no lead was detected, so there's probably no lead white. And what we can see is that the white rose in the center contains most lead, which makes sense because that one is painted with lead white. It's painted with the pigment lead white, so there's most lead present there. But we can see that in the background there's also lead present, and also in some of the other flowers in the garland, because she mixed in white everywhere basically. Two of the other maps that I want to discuss very briefly, because they're not that interesting in this for this painting, are the iron and the manganese maps. And these pigments can be associated with earth pigments, so that means like red ochre, yellow ochre, umbers, everything that's in the range of browns. And what we see here is that most iron, but also manganese, is detected in the background, which again makes sense because the background of that painting is brown. But I want to continue with a distribution map that is very interesting. and that is the potassium map. Potassium can be associated with a variety of pigments, including ultramarine, and that's the pigment that you see down here. And in the distribution map here, we see that potassium is mostly present in the upper part of the garland, so the leaves of the ivy. And when I studied this painting with the microscope, I could tell that those leaves were painted with a mixture of a blue and a yellow pigment. So she most likely used ultramarine mixed with a yellow pigment to create the green of the ivy leaves. This is quite extraordinary because ultramarine was super expensive. A kilo of ultramarine was more expensive than a kilo of gold. So the fact that she used ultramarine for such an unimportant area in the composition tells us something about this commission. It was a very important painting. Either she thought that only the best and the most expensive pigments would do, or the person who commissioned this painting asked her to use a lot of ultramarine. Because if it wasn't, then she could have chosen to work with a cheaper blue pigment such as smalt or indigo, or she could have chosen to use a green pigment to create the green in the leaves. Talking about greens, the copper map, this is the copper map, and copper can be linked to blue and green pigments as well. So verdigris, azurite, they all contain loads of copper. And we see that most of the copper detected is coming from the lower part of the garland, where she included some green leaves. So she also used a copper, probably copper green pigment to create the range of greens visible in a flower garland. So she used different pigments to create this sort of variety of tones of green. But what is most interesting about this map is that there is a little thing in the upper left corner that I was like, this doesn't make sense to me. And I was looking at this and I thought, it almost looks like a ribbon. And in the pendant painting of the flower garland with dragonfly, we see that Wautier included blue ribbons to attach the garland to the skulls. But they are not present in flower garland with butterfly. She didn't paint any ribbons. In fact, she did paint one ribbon, but she decided during the painting stage, during the painting process, that that was not what she wanted to go for, and she overpainted it. And if you look very closely at the painting nowadays, I could definitely see it with the microscope, but if you know where to look, you can see it with the naked eye as well. You could see some blue paint shimmering through in this area. So there is at least an underpainting stage for a blue ribbon in that area, but she decided that that was not the vibe that she was going for in the end. Lastly, I want to talk about the arsenic map. So here in this arsenic map, we can see that there's a lot of arsenic in very localized areas, and they correspond with the yellow and the orange flowers in the garden. So they were painted with an arsenic-based pigment, and that pigment is orpiment, which we can see here in the lower picture. Orpiment has some really nice qualities. As you can maybe see in this image, it has a very shimmering quality. It's very lush, bright yellow to orange. It's really nice. It's just beautiful when you look at it. However, working with orpiment as a pigment, it has a lot of downsides. You cannot mix it with copper-based pigments, you cannot mix it with lead-based pigments, and it has the tendency to discolor. So it discolors very badly in the course of a couple of centuries. And this is something that 17th century artists knew, and most artists avoided working with this pigment. But flower painters did not avoid this pigment. Flower painters, especially like specialized flower painters, they loved working with this because this pigment gave them the qualities of working with This pigment has such qualities that allowed them to create very lifelike, very lush, naturalistic-looking flowers. And it was most often used to paint marigolds, which we also have one here in Wautier's flower garland. So far, however, what is interesting is that Flower Garland with Butterfly is the only painting by Wautier in which this pigment has been positively identified. She seemed to have never used this pigment outside of the flower pieces. And that makes me wonder if she was aware that specialized flower painters use this pigment and that she wanted to try it out as well and to find out if this pigment is really worth it to create the optical effects, the 3D naturalistic effects that a flower painting needs. And this is also the moment to briefly consider the support of this painting. Flower Garland with Butterfly is painted on a panel support. So here you can see the backside of the painting. This is the panel. Wautier almost never worked on panel. She really preferred canvas. I think about 90% of her paintings are painted on canvas. But for her flower pieces, she chose to work on panel. And again, we're not sure exactly why she made this choice, but this may have to do with the conventions in flower painting at the time. Canvas was the preferred support for most painters. But again, flower painters, specialized flower painters, they prefer to work on panel because this is a smoother surface to work on, so it allows for a more precise paint application, and it results in a more naturalistic, lifelike painting, still life. So with her choice for panel support and the inclusion of orpiment as a pigment, I think we see that Wautier is adapting her materials to fit in with what was common for 17th century still lifes. She saw what other artists were doing, and that was very successful, so she sort of adapted that, and because she also wanted, of course, her paintings to be beautiful and very high quality. But we do not only see that influence in the materials that she used, but we also see it when we're looking at the painting techniques that she used. Here is the mercury map of Flower Garland with Butterfly. Mercury, it can be associated with the pigment vermilion, the bright red pigment vermilion, which you can see here in the lower picture. And we can see that she used vermilion for her roses, for instance, for the red flowers and the pink flowers. But we already see that there's more vermilion in this distribution map than there are red flowers in the painting. So for instance, this, what was probably an underpainting for a rose, turned out to be a completely different flower. And again, here too, she probably prepared a pink rose, but it turned out to be a green leaf. So she was sort of making changes to the composition as she goes. But this map also shows how she prepared for these individual flowers, and more specifically for the roses. Again, if we look at this one again, it's a very sort of flat, round shape. So she used a underpainting without any definitions, just basically drew a circle in pink or bright red paint that she used to work up later to add the petals and the shadows and the highlights. But she started out with a very flat red or pink shape, a round shape. And this was confirmed when we were looking at our paint sample. So this is the paint sample in visible light and in UV light, and it was taken from that rose over there. There's a lot of things you can see in this image. We have the ground layer that was used to prepare the panel. Layer 2 is a very thin brownish layer to give like a tone to the white ground, because the white ground is very bright and artists usually don't want to work on a very bright white ground. And then layer 3 is the underpainting that I was just talking about, that consists of vermilion and that white, and is a very sort of like flat and even in tone. And then on top of that layer, there are multiple paint layers with varying ratios of red and white to create the highlights and the shadows in the rows. And anyway, that Mercury map of Wautier's flower garland reminded me of the painting techniques of other artists, more particularly of Daniel Segers. And here on the right, on the far right, we see one of his paintings, a cartouche with flower garlands, and this detail is the picture that you see here in the middle. We see a particular bouquet, and this is a bouquet that he painted very often. He basically copied and pasted this bouquet in multiple of his paintings. A couple of years ago, a fellow researcher of mine found an unfinished painting by Daniel Segers. And that is the painting that you're looking up here on the left. This is a panel by Segers. He completed a painting on the backside of it. So he was at some point probably working on this, decided I don't longer want this, turned around the panel and continued on another composition. But what we see here is that the dark background has already been painted, and the individual flowers for the exact same bouquet that we see here are prepared for. So we have an orange oval for the tulip, a pink circle for the rose, and then a yellow circle for the marigold, a red circle for the poppy, etc. So this is the way that Segers prepared for his compositions. That was the underpainting, and then he would work up the colors using shadows and highlight to create the actual flower. Segers, as far as we know now, Segers was the first one to introduce this painting technique, but he was very influential, and a lot of flower painters adapted this technique. But in 1652, when Wautier painted her flower pieces, that technique was not yet widespread. So I think in Wautier's flower garden, we really see her adaptation of this technique. She also used that same red underpainting for her roses, at least. So I think what we can see based on the technical analysis that she was maybe an early adapter of this technique. And that tells us maybe that she was in contact with Daniel Segers. Here we see the guy on the left. Daniel Segers was active in Antwerp in the first half of the 17th century. As I said, he was very influential. He was very successful. His paintings were sought after. All the kings, queens, emperors, dukes in Europe wanted paintings by his hand because he was so good. And that includes our good friend Leopold Wilhelm, Archduke of the Netherlands in the mid-17th century. Leopold Wilhelm was an avid art collector, and he had a preference for flower pieces, more specifically flower pieces by Daniel Segers. We also know that he was a big fan of Michaelina Wautier because he had at least 3 paintings by her in his collection. So there's a link between Wautier and Daniel Segers, and that's Leopold Wilhelm. I cannot imagine that they would have never met if Archduke Leopold Wilhelm was such an art lover. I can imagine that he was like, oh, I know this great artist in Brussels, Michaelina Wautier, she's exceptional. Maybe he told Segers about her. Maybe he told her about Segers' work. In any case, I think it's very likely that Michaelina Wautier was able to study paintings in the collection of Leopold Wilhelm. So she was very likely familiar with the works by Daniel Segers. If they have never met, then at least she was able to study his paintings up close. So this technical research into this specific painting helped us to reconstruct her artistic network, her professional network. She was, I think she was very aware of painting techniques used by specialized flower painters in Antwerp, and she took inspiration from that. That's all nice, but still, that's professional network. But what about Michaelina Wautier, the artist, or the person? Who was she? I think we can learn more about her especially when we study her self-portrait. So this is her autonomous self-portrait. We see her sitting at the easel, ready to start painting. She's wearing a very nice silk dress and a very nice black velvet cape. Based on the technical analysis that I've done into the paintings by Wautier, what I can tell about this painting is that it is a very realistic painting in terms of artistic practice. I just want to say that she was not painting in a silk dress and a velvet cape. But what we see here, the palette, those are the pigments that she used. The canvas on the easel is prepared with a ground that she typically would use. On that ground, we see a painted sketch. I have a close-up in a second. We see a painted sketch. She would prepare for her paintings with a painted sketch. In this case, the painted sketch is made in a white and a dark brown paint. That is what she would do. So in terms of her artistic practice, she is showing us what she would have done in real life. This is how she worked. So that was really nice. I just want to talk briefly about the X-radiography that we did on this painting. So with X-radiography, we can see through the paint layers, through the object, and we can see underneath, like if there's any changes to the composition or basically anything that is present under the surface. What shows up white in an X-radiograph is there's either more material or the material that is present is made of heavier elements. We see what shows up white here is the skin tone, her face, her hands, her white dress. That is because those areas are painted with lead white. Lead is a heavy element, so that shows up in an X-radiograph. Nice little detail, she looks almost bald in the X-radiograph because she prepared skin tone underneath her hair, as we all have skin underneath our hair. And to create that effect that you actually see someone's skin through the hair, especially like around the edges where the hair stops. So she did that because it creates a very realistic portrait. Now I want to zoom in a little bit, if it works. Yes. So we are looking at the detail of her shoulder and her arm. And she made changes to the composition. So initially, she painted a more simpler lace collar that extended over her arm. So that is the collar that was initially painted. But during the painting process, she decided that she wanted a more complex, more dynamic, and a more intricate lace collar, and she decided to change that. But also what changed is that initially the contour of her body continued from that lace collar down. Again, she decided to change that, and she decided to paint more fabric of the black cape to the left of that contour. And what that does is she makes herself bigger. And normally you would think, like, why would you do that? But she's taking up physically more space in the composition, as if she wants to say, this portrait is about me. I am the main actor here. I am the main, the show. So she's really showing her confidence because she knows that this portrait is about her, and she knows that she needs to show this to the outside world. So this tells us something about her personality. This painting also tells us something about her ambition, and I want to show that to you through by looking at the painted sketch. This is a detail of the painted sketch on the canvas as it is now visible in the galleries. It's very hard to see anything, but in the past, this sketch has been interpreted as the preparations for a portrait of a man, because we only knew of portraits of men by Michaelina's hand, right? She's known for portraits of men, so it makes sense. I was able to do microscopy, a microscopic examination of the painting, and with that I had a high-resolution image next to me, and I could trace the original paint layers, the paint brushstrokes on that high-resolution image to enhance the painted sketch and to be able to really see what we're looking at. And this is the result. And this is up for discussion. I think we're looking at a woman, but it's up for discussion. I will show you why this is up for discussion in a bit. But we can see a person, obviously a face. The person is either wearing a headdress or he or she has long hair. The person is looking upwards to the sky. There's also some detail in the eyes, that the eyes are also upward. It's not like the tilted head, but it's also the eyes going upwards. And there's a couple of more horizontal brushstrokes here that I think could suggest like the fingers of a folded hand. But also that is up for discussion. That's my interpretation. I already said that Michaelina is showing her artistic practice very realistically. And this is also the case for the painted sketch, because we know of a painting by her hand that looks very similar. And that is the St. John the Evangelist. It is very similar in terms of composition. We see, so what she's showing, so we see again a person looking upwards. This is why I think this could also be a man, because if you trace the outlines of this figure, you get a very similar image to that. So again, up for discussion. But what we see here is that Michaelina is really showing us her studio practice. She made paintings like this. So she included a painted sketch of a painting that she would actually make. Interesting to note is that she is also presenting herself as such as a history painter, because a composition like this is a history painting. It's a saintly figure. History painting in the 17th century was considered the highest in the hierarchy of the painting genres, because it required invention, it required anatomical knowledge. Like you, as a painter, you can be good in applying paint, but to make a history painting, you also needed to have knowledge about antiquity or the Bible. So it really requires more, and that's why that genre was considered highest in the hierarchy. And the fact that Wautier is showing herself as a history painter shows us that she was very confident. She's telling the world, like, I can do this. I am just as good as Rubens or any other artist who would paint history scenes. So again, a very confident painting. And she's showing us that she was aware of contemporary ideas about painting and how she fits into those ideas. That's a detail up close. Lastly, I also want to briefly talk about how her self-portrait fits in with the tradition of self-portraits of artists at work. The self-portrait of an artist at work, that theme was invented by female artists in the 16th century. Why? Because female artists had to prove that they were capable of doing this. Because we all know, of course, women are not very capable, so they always have to prove that they are. So here we see an example of a 16th century painting. It's basically the equivalent of a selfie showing you that you can do this. Again, I just want to highlight that Sofonisba Anguissola is also working on a history painting. Just a quick reminder. And in any case, women artists often included history scenes or a scene that they were famous for, like Judith Leister, for instance, made a self-portrait at work while painting on a genre painting because she only painted genre paintings. So that was her sort of advertisement for herself. But I'm showing you this Anguissola self-portrait because it is possible that Wautier was familiar with the work of Anguissola. Again, this goes back to Leopold Wilhelm, who was an art collector, and he also owned a self-portrait by Sofonisba Anguissola. That painting is unfortunately lost. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but the fact that he had it in his collection probably means that Wautier was familiar with that work, but maybe also with other works by Anguissola. She was probably familiar with Anguissola as an artist. So this really, I think she's taking inspiration from her fellow female artists of the period prior to when she was active. Lastly, this is the last thing I want to point out, is the palettes in both paintings. They're very similar. So here on the right with Anguissola, we see a very similar palette with blacks, red, white, and then mixed to flesh tones. With Wautier, we see the same thing. So the upper row is unmixed paint, browns, blacks, red, a yellow, and a white. And then the lower row is the mixed paints that are used for painting flesh tones. This is not a coincidence. A lot of artists showed their palette with flesh tones because, again, in the 16th and 17th century, art critics or the art theory of the time was that the highest skill an artist could have is paint life-looking flesh. That was the hardest thing to do. So if you could do that, then you are successful as an artist. So many artists included a flesh tone palette in their paint self-portraits to show basically everyone, yes, I can paint life-looking flesh. So both artists did that. Again, Wautier showing the world that she was capable of actually painting high-quality paintings. She was aware of the theories of the time and the art critics' comments, and she made sure that her self-portrait really fit into what was considered the highest quality of painting at the time. So, by studying Wautier's works closely, using technical analysis, we can learn a lot about her that we cannot learn through archival research. So we now have a clue about her personality. The self-portrait tells us that she's very confident. She makes herself bigger to take up more space. She is showing the world that she was capable of painting history paintings. She's capable of painting life-looking flesh. The flower garland tells us something about her artistic and professional network. She was not working in a vacuum. She was aware of other artists. She was taking inspiration from them, not only iconographically or stylistically, but also in terms of materials and techniques that she would use. So I think this has really taught us a lot. Of course, there's still a lot of questions regarding Michaelina Wautier. But I'm confident that we can find out more if we do more analysis of her paintings and also of paintings of people close to her, such as her brother Charles. So finally, I want to say thank you all for coming today. And also, I want to thank a couple of institutions and people for helping me do this research. The funding institutions, the Fonds Wetenschappelijk Onderzoek in Belgium, Flanders State-of-the-Art Fellowship that allowed me to do actual research. And of course, colleagues in the field at the University of Antwerp, but also at the MFA Boston, and the owners of the paintings that allowed me to actually touch these paintings. And that's a scary part, I know. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you feel uncomfortable asking in English, ich spreche auch ein bisschen Deutsch. Ich verstehe fast alles im Deutsch, aber ich werde antworten in Englisch. Thank you.